Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to look at how we can add FIDO2 related queries to a Hot Chocolate 13 GraphQL API. So I have a new solution with my API project, like so. Within the API project, I have a data migrations directory. This has our create identity schema migration and our add FIDO2 related entities migration. We've also got our application DB context class, which contains our three FIDO-related tables, and then we also configure those entities within our database schema. We've then got our application user class, which contains a collection of public key credentials, and then we have our three FIDO2 related entities, including the most important one, our public key credential entity, which is the entity class that will actually model the public key credentials. Within our app settings.development.json, we have a default connection string, which points to our local development database, which will store that data for us. Last but not least, inside our program.c#, we add in our application DB context. We add a GraphQL server, and then within the middleware, we map the GraphQL endpoint in order to set up the GraphQL API. So the first thing that we are going to want to do is register our application DB context class in our GraphQL server. So what we're going to do, where we have our builder.services.add_GraphQL server, we're going to want to say register DB context, like so. And this is going to be of type application DB context. And that registers our application DB context with the GraphQL server to enable things like dependency injection, etc. Now, one thing that you may have spotted in our public key credential entity, the identifier is of type byte array. Now, typically, identifiers will more often than not be either strings or integers. For example, they might be a GUID. However, in this case, the ID is stored as a byte array. Now, the ID scaler in GraphQL provided by Hot Chocolate currently, at the time of recording, supports strings and integers. It doesn't, out of the box, support byte arrays. So what we need to do is we need to add a type converter to the GraphQL server in order to convert from a byte array to a string and vice versa. And that will allow us to use the ID scaler for our byte array ID property in the public key credential type. So what we're going to do inside our program.c#, where we do our call to add GraphQL server, we're going to add a couple of type converters. So I'm going to say add GraphQL server.add type converter, and it's going to be of type byte array to string. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to say web encoders, and then we're going to say dot base64 URL encode. And what this will do is it will take the byte array and it will encode it to a base64 URL string. And the string is then compatible with the ID scaler. As I previously mentioned, the ID scaler supports strings and integers. Next up, we're going to want to do the same thing, but in reverse. So we're going to add a type converter from string to byte array. And in order to do this, we're going to do the same as above, but instead of encoding, we're going to decode. So in this instance, it will take a base64 URL encoded string, and it will decode that string to a byte array. So those are the type converters from a byte array to a string and vice versa. And what we're now going to do is we're going to create a GraphQL type for our public key credential. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click the API project, and I'm going to add a new directory. called types. Within this types directory, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call this public key credential type, like so. Now this class is going to extend the hot chocolate object type, and the object type is going to be type of public key credential, like so. Within this class, we're going to want to override the configure method. And within here, I'm going to say descriptor.bind fields explicitly. And then I'm going to say descriptor.name. And I'm going to name this type public key credential, like so. Next up, I'm going to set up a binding for the identifier field. So to do this, I'm going to say descriptor.field. And then within the expression, I'm going to say credential.id. Now you'll recall that the ID property is of type byte array, but I'm going to want this to appear as an ID scalar in the GraphQL schema because it's an identifier. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify the type of the field. And I'm going to say that this is a non-null type of type ID type, like so. And what this means is in the GraphQL schema, that ID property or field will appear as an ID scalar within the schema. And because we've set up the type converter to convert from a string to a byte array and vice versa, the hot chocolate GraphQL middleware will automatically handle the converting of the ID scalar, which in our case will be a string value. It will automatically handle the converting of that into a base64 URL encoded byte array. So now that we've set up that public key credential type, we're going to want to create a query type for our GraphQL API. So what I'm going to do inside our API project, I'm going to add a new class and I'm going to call it query, like so. And back inside our program.c#, I'm going to add in the query type to our GraphQL server. In order to do that, I'm going to say .add query type, and I'm going to pass in a type query, like so. And that will indicate to hot chocolate the type for our query. If we close that now and go back to our query class, we can add in a query to get public key credentials. So what we're going to do is we're going to say public iQueryable of type public key credential, like so. I'm going to call this method get public key credentials. And I'm going to want our application DB context injected into the method. And within the body of the method, I'm simply going to say return context.public key credentials. Last but not least, I'm going to tell GraphQL that the return type from this method is going to be our previously created public key credential type, or in this case, a list of that type. In order to do that, we're going to add in our GraphQL type attribute, like so. And we're going to specify this is going to be a type of, and it's going to be non-null type of type list type, like so. And that's going to be of type non-null type of type public key credential type. So what this means is in the schema, this query is going to return a non-null list of non-null public key credentials. Now, inside that public key credential type, you'll notice that I've only set up a binding for the identifier field for the purposes of this sample. However, feel free to add or remove any other fields that you may want to have bound in your GraphQL schema. To keep things straightforward, I'm simply going to bind the ID property for an ID field in the schema. However, feel free to bind other properties in order to have them available within the GraphQL schema, depending on your API's requirements. So what I am going to do now is I'm going to build and run the GraphQL API. So up here in the top right, I'm going to hit the run button there, like so. This is going to build and then run our API on localhost port 7054. And if I open the browser to port 7054/GraphQL, we can see here that we have the Nitro user interface for our GraphQL API. If I click on the Browse Schema button here, we can see that we have our query type over on the right-hand side. And this query type has a field called public key credentials. And this is the get public key credentials method that we defined in the query class previously. You'll notice it returns a non-null list of non-null public key credential. And we can see inside our public key credential type, we have our ID field. That ID field is of type non-null ID. And as I mentioned earlier, the type converters that we added in the startup automatically map between the ID scalar and the byte array. You may also have additional fields in this type if you added additional fields to the bindings in the public key credential type within the types directory of the GraphQL API. So what we are going to do is we are going to click onto the Operation tab like so, and we're going to write a query to get public key credentials. So what we're going to do is we're going to say query, and then we're going to say public key credentials, and then we're going to select ID, like so. Give that document a format, and then hit run. And we can see here that we have in our response data, public key credentials, and this is a list of our public key credentials, which currently contains a single credential with this base64 URL encoded ID. If we go back to our IDE, and if we click on the database tab, you'll notice that we have here our database. And within the FIDO2 public key credentials, you'll see that we have already previously created a public key credential for the purposes of this sample. And we can see this public key credential is returned to us within the query response from our GraphQL API. You'll notice here that the ID is a base64 URL encoded string, and if we were to decode this string, then that would give us this GUID value that we can see here in the ID column of the database. So what we've covered in this video is registering our application DB context within the GraphQL API. We've then added two type converters to convert from a byte array to a string and vice versa. And that will allow us to serialize and deserialize byte arrays as the ID scalar in the GraphQL schema. We've then added a public key credential type, and we've explicitly bound the identifier field, the ID property of the public key credential class. We've then added a query type into our GraphQL API, and we've added a public key credentials method or query into that class, which means that we can then, through the GraphQL API, query for a list of public key credentials that we retrieve from our database using the application DB context. So I hope you found this video useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.